Hi everyone, the name is Nat. Today we are looking at Autism Vs Dyslexia, the battle of the ages. It's not so much a battle, but looking at the similarities and the differences. Today we are predominantly focusing on dyslexia and autism, but of course all of these interlink and co-occur together. It's just interesting that dyslexia and autism are some of the most prevalent and also most well-known of the neurodevelopmental conditions. So I wanted to see what actually joins them together here. Here's our team. Today, we have so many of the team. We've got myself, we've got April, we've got Tim, we've got Seven, we've got Opie, who didn't want his photo in there. So yep, great to have the team today. The last one we did is ADD in women, looking at how ADHD presents itself in women and how typically it doesn't have the hyperactivity element to it. Do check that out. You can go on our YouTube, just Exceptional Individuals on YouTube. Autism Vs Dyslexia. They are very different. Then why do they often go along with each other? In many ways, these conditions contradict each other. It's like they're two ends of the spectrum. If they are polar opposites in some respects, how can they always be together? Not everyone with autism has dyslexia. Not everyone with dyslexia has autism. But a lot of people do have the co-occurrence. Well, let's have a little look about neurodevelopmental disorders. Typically, when we use the abbreviation ND, we're talking about neurodivergence. But today, we're going more on the science side. We're looking at neurodevelopmental disorders. These are things which are with you your entire life. They are things that happen very early on, either when you're still tucked up in your mama's tummy or when you are recently born, when you're still developing. Most of these, for instance, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, autism, these are things that happen really early on. But you might notice I've also included things like Tourette's and OCD. Are they actually a neurodevelopmental disorder? It depends what period of time you're asking, because OCD used to be a form of anxiety. In recent years, there's been more debate and discussion that actually some people seemingly are born with it, or at least develop it very early on. A lot of people develop Tourette's or OCD in early adolescence, when the brain is still forming. In terms of neurodevelopmental, that just counts as when the brain is still growing. As you can see here, there's lots of little icons, and essentially they are just demonstrating the key characteristics. These labels are just nice little bows to tie around a bunch of characteristics in order to give people some sort of tangible things that they can talk about. Life isn't that simple. We do all blur and mold into all shapes and figurations. So do know, life's more complicated than a couple of labels. I want one word for all of you that you associate with neurodevelopmental disorders. This can be positive, negative, neutral, anything in between. While you're doing that, here's just a quick look at the prevalence. Today, as we're focusing mainly on autism and dyslexia, autism is about 1 in 100, dyslexia is about 1 in 10. There's a significant difference between how prevalent they are, but still quite prevalent in the wider community. That just means how likely it is that you're going to run into them, find out about it. Oh, inconsistency. Also true, Tim. Misunderstood. Yep. Problem solving, cognitive overload, creative, empathetic. It's interesting because, again, neurodevelopmental, we're talking more from the science perspective rather than the kind of empowering neurodiversity movement, which is about accepting that brains are different and arguably utilizing the difference as an advantage. Would that quite go in with this? I think so. We're going to be talking about the medical model, which I think we're predominantly looking at today, but also the social model. The social model doesn't forget about all the medical diagnosis. It uses both of them. Both have merit and credibility. We've got, genius, nice, problem solving, processing, problems at school. As you can see, we've got a bit of a mixture here. It's a mixed bag. It's not all doom and gloom, but it's also not all sunshine and rainbows. When we talk about the medical model, we're essentially saying what you got there, what's going on in the head, well, that's a problem. But don't worry, we might be able to fix it by identifying it, examining it, hopefully eliminating it. Don't get me wrong, doesn't sound overly progressive in terms of what we're talking about 9 times out of 10. The other model, though, is the old social model, This is saying, you know what? Ain't nothing wrong with this noggin. Society's the problem. It didn't develop for my way of processing the world. It's not people with disability. We need support and accommodation. The definition of neurodevelopmental disorders are conditions that affect how your brain functions. They range from mild impairment, allowing those affected to live fairly normal lives, to severe disorders that require lifelong care. So what this is saying is it just affects your brain, but it affects it very differently. And what I want to get across, though, is do not think that these two models are at odds against each other. They can work really nicely together. The medical model is really great at offering support for those who feel really. The social model is a great way for people to feel more a level of acceptance. Just FYI, we're predominantly focusing on the medical model today. Before we go on to the comparison, let's look at autism, then we're going to look at dyslexia, then we're going to look at both of them together. Autism, according to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, Volume 5, says autism is a combination between social communication difficulties and repetitive behavior and sensory sensitivities. It's the overlap between them. This is called the dyad of impairments. Any of your old timers might have thought, I thought it was a triad of impairments. Forget about triads. Who needs 3? Let's just stick it with 2. Apparently it was just a little bit easier, made a little bit more sense. It made my graphic looks a little bit neater. They have the exact same things in them. This one, they just merge a few together. Autism is really complicated. This is a super simple way to understand it. If you have this, when you have them at the same time, you have autism in an absolute nutshell. The DSM-5, this is like the big old manual we use to understand and diagnose things. It should be known there's also the ICD, which is more used in the UK. However, the DSM-5 is used worldwide also. They're interchangeable. Honestly, there are differences between them, but not enough to lose sleep over. In the DSM-5, they say autism is social communication and interaction deficits. A deficit is just a lack of compared to the majority of the population. Then we've got repetitive behavior and restricted interests. When you get kind of gridlocked on one thing, you might be an absolute expert in one area, put all your eggs in one basket, get a little bit distressed if that gets disrupted. We've got early development onset. All that means is if you're going to be autistic, you're going to be autistic really early on in life, either the second you're born or really early on in development. Autism can be both genetic and environmental, which means we don't really know what causes it. We just know it happens early on in life. We know that there are significant impairments. This is going to be one of the key differences between, say, dyslexia and autism, is the amount of impairments that one may get as a result of it. It's not attributed to other conditions. Autism is very much like a standalone thing. It doesn't need to hang out with others. It can be perfectly happy on its own. Honestly, a lot of people do have multiple, but it doesn't need to. We've come a long way in our understanding of autism. Maybe what I'm saying today might be out to date in a few years' time. Starting off with the original manual in the 50s, it was basically schizophrenia in children. No one wanted that. That wasn't exactly lovely to have. Then we're like, number 2, still schizophrenia in children. Oh, then in the 80s, it's not schizophrenia now. It's infantile autism. Essentially, only children can have autism. And at this stage, it was really only males as well. So boys could have autism. Then 87, autistic disorder was a bit more of a well-rounded condition. This is when we started to have conditions like Asperger's, we had Rett's, we had classic autism. We had lots of different ways of classifying autism. This was getting confusing. It also wasn't that helpful. It also didn't explain all the nuances of autism. Finally, 2013, we got all this knowledge that we've acquired over decades. We squashed them all together into ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. When we talk about Autism Spectrum Disorder, we're just talking about lots of different ways of processing information that has a few overlapping factors. Those overlapping factors is around the repetition, sensory information, and communication deficit. So that's why autism is incredibly broad. I want you to let me know of some misunderstandings that you have heard before. Only affects children, caused by poor parenting. These aren't true. These are all things that people keep believing. They're not true. It's something that we need to really nip in the bud ASAP. One thing is that autism is functioning, as in high functioning, low functioning, either more autistic, less autistic. Doesn't work like that. Autism's a three-dimensional sphere. That some people might be really good at verbal communication but struggle with independent living. Other people will be great at attention to detail, where some people will struggle with basic needs. It can affect people in different ways. It can also affect you differently depending on what's going on in your life. But yeah, forget about the whole functioning levels malarkey. Not true. Can it be cured? No, it can't be cured. Even if it could be cured, we don't want it to be cured. All individuals have savant skills. People love Dustin Hoffman, but we're not Ray-Ban. Caused by vaccines? No, it's not. This is one that I said a lot of you have heard before. Not true. Zero facts in that. Only occurs in children? Not at all. It's for life. Caused by bad parenting? No, but people used to think that due to that pesky refrigerator theory. Yes, Stephanie agrees. We're talking about acceptance, not cure. Paul Adonis says, every time someone says it's caused by a vaccine, I ask why they don't have it. Honestly, mud sticks. You get a couple of Sun newspaper headlines and people believe it for the end of time. So there's a lot of things we need to learn about autism. Let's move on to dyslexia. Dyslexia, nice and simple. It's also a developmental condition, but rather than being more broad, it focuses on reading. Of course, it affects other areas such as memory, retention. It can affect a whole heap of areas. Essentially, in order to have dyslexia, you've got to have some difficulties in reading. It doesn't mean you can't read, but there's got to be something there which makes it a bit more challenging. Then you might have difficulties with spelling. This could be remembering spelling. This could be retrieval of the spelling. It could be creative spelling. It could be many different ways. And then you've got the phonological awareness, how you speak, how you pronounce words. There might be, I'm always muddling my words, mushing them together, skipping beats. If you have all of these, then it's potential that you could have dyslexia. Not guaranteed, of course, because there's a lot of nuances, but it could be. Oh, I'm still waiting on my special powers. Yeah, LaDonna, I'm waiting for those superpowers as well. I've not had them yet. It's like I'm just waiting for my Marvel movie, but it hasn't happened. If my superpower is social awkwardness, then fair enough, but haven't got it. I often wonder if dyslexia or autism was a superpower, they put us in the Avengers. Don't get me wrong, would be better than Black Widow, but I don't think would be much of an asset to the team at all. Anyway, dyslexia, according to the old NHS, is a common learning difficulty that mainly causes problems with reading, writing, spelling. It's a specific learning difficulty, which means it causes problems with certain abilities used for learning, such as reading and writing. Depending if you're using DSM or the ICD in terms of how you define these things, they use slightly different language, okay? I'm predominantly using the DSM today, not for any other reason. I just think they categorize it a little bit more simplistic, but they're both valid. Dyslexia doesn't have as much of an interesting history compared to autism. In DSM-1, wasn't even included. Dyslexia, what? Then number 2, wasn't included. Okay, finally in the 80s, because the 80s were a great decade, developmental reading disorder. Okay, that sounds a lot like dyslexia. Developmental, yes. Reading, yes. Disorder, you could say so. I would say, though, this doesn't really tell you much. It's too narrow, and actually there's more to it. Then we've also got developmental reading disorder. Oh, then we just got reading disorder, because actually you can have dyslexia and it not be developmental. It can also be acquired, meaning through head injuries or other life events. And finally, we've got specific learning disorders. The reason why they use the word specific is because it normally focuses on a very narrow area of learning. It could be reading, it could be writing, it could be numbers, it could be spelling. It typically focused in one area. Dyslexia is like a subcategory, but the main subtitle is specific learning disorder. This is why you typically will have dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia kind of grouped together because they have a lot of genetic overlap. Oh, Marie says, I'm great in a crisis and could talk my way out of most things. It might be helpful. Yeah, I could see that. I want to know, how does dyslexia impact daily life? And it'll be interesting to see because, again, we know it's not just about reading. Once we know that, are there any overlaps with autism? Because on the surface, they seem like very different conditions. Visual processing can very much be affected. Emotional impact, I would say that also has strong overlap with autism. Compensatory strategies, this is when you fit one roadblock, you make a bit of a pivot and you find another direction to go in. I would say that has a lot of overlap with autism as well. Processing speed, absolutely. Memory, yep. Also, naming deficits, maybe, but not so much. Because naming deficits is when you're able to name things really quickly. And phonological processing, maybe you struggle with the pronunciation of the words. All right, what do we have here? We have exhaustion. I'm feeling that most days. It can affect writing and a sense of direction besides reading. Yes, it can. There's a lot of overlap between dysgraphia and dyslexia when it comes to direction. But you'll notice I'm purposely trying not to say dyspraxia because dyspraxia is its kind of own category because it's more motor coordination. We've got frustration, especially if you have a high level of understanding, but struggle to read, write, spell. Yes, that's a really cool one because it's not about intellectual disability. It's about how you process information, not the fact that you were unable to process. We've got the inability to effectively communicate with colleagues, meaning everyday work can be a struggle. And I think that's the key word here, effectively. It's not saying you can't, but your colleagues' way of understanding and your way of understanding are sometimes at odds. Got remembering and processing. Yep, absolutely. What do we also have in the comments? What age can you have your child assessed for dyslexia? I think any age. Like some people can do 2 or 3, but for me, I had autism and dyspraxia at 2 or 3 and dyslexia at 16, but it can be diagnosed quite early. I would imagine it would typically be at the age when you start to learn to read. Oh, Amanda says people cannot trust you as even though you know the information, you may not be able to convey verbally or written. That is true, actually. I could be at a pub quiz. I absolutely know the answer, but my darn dyslexia will say the wrong word. People think I didn't know the answer, even though I was so certain. Oh, Stephanie says schools usually say age 7. Thanks for that. Yeah, dyslexia can impact people in many different ways. But just like autism, there are myths. What are the myths? So we got dyslexia is just reversing letters. Dyslexia involves phonological issues. Dyslexia equals low intelligence. Dyslexia disappears with age. And dyslexia affects both genders equally. Let's see, most of you got right. Dyslexia, it's not about reversing letters. Maybe some people experience like that, but that's a bit of a caricature when it comes to talking about it. Dyslexia involves phonological issues, absolutely. Essentially, the English language is a bunch of codes. Our brains have to process those codes. Those with dyslexia can struggle with that processing. Dyslexia equals low intelligence? Absolutely not true. The way we present questions can make it more difficult for those with dyslexia to interpret it, but it's not to do with intelligence. Dyslexia disappears with age. No, it definitely does not. It can ease with age depending on your environment, but it doesn't go away because it's part of who you are. Dyslexia affects both genders equally. It does affect genders differently, but the reason I'm a little bit on the fence is it's not, say, as contrasting as, say, ADHD or autism. A good way to understand dyslexia is the kind of theory of reading. You've got D plus LC equals RC. But essentially, in order to read, there's a few things we need to do. We need to start decoding. This is like solving that algorithm, that puzzle. That's our first issue with dyslexia. We're struggling with the decoding. Then, once we've decoded it, you being able to understand it, that is when you have comprehension. Those with dyslexia can struggle with either decoding or comprehension or both. This is also why it can look very different in a number of individuals. There definitely are, I don't have them to hand right now, typically males do have a higher diagnosis rate, but that's more due to the fact they get more support because it's more obvious when they're struggling. But I believe the gap isn't as wide as the others. We've looked at autism, we've looked at dyslexia. Let's look at the overlap and the comorbidity or co-occurrence. Comorbidity just means that if you have one thing, you're likely to have another because all these things have a lot of genetic links. They're not that different from like a biological level, but there are some different. Can we talk about autism is its own separate one, but there is still a lot of overlap. You'll notice that on this particular diagram, we've not put dyslexia. That's because there isn't as much of a genetic link to autism as there is to autism and ADHD. Like I said, in many ways, autism and dyslexia are like two separate ends of the spectrum. We've got a good diagram in a minute to show you on that. Now, in terms of overlap, we've got the language processing. Both of them can impact how we communicate and read, not because you struggle to read, but how you struggle with the comprehension side of reading. Then we got executive functioning. This is just common issues with memory, planning, and flexibility, very much in both. Sensory processing. This is sensitivity affecting learning and social interactions. More prevalent in autism in a more broader sense, but definitely can impact elements of dyslexia. Then we've got educational implications. This just means needing customized support, having your own personal learning plan. I think this is quite a good diagram because people while dyslexia and autism have similarities, they are distinct categories. With autism, that is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Things like ADHD and autism would be in this broad category. They are a lot more less defined. If you learn in different ways, but every single element of your life is impacted by that different way of learning, that would be a more of a generic neurodevelopmental disorder. Dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia are very much often grouped together. They are individual conditions. You have one and not the other, but they are often grouped together. And these are the ones that you'll typically get diagnosed for at school, where ADHD, autism, I also pick central auditory processing disorder. Not one we typically cover, but it does very much go in with the neurodevelopmental disorders. The reason why is you can have that and not have autism. So I think it's quite interesting to split them too. It starts to make a lot more sense in terms of how they impact our life and the severity. It's often why those who have these conditions down the right-hand side are considered needing more support. Those on the left are considered needing less support on the whole. I thought I had a hearing problem for years. It's really interesting, central auditory processing disorder, because it's not about hearing, it's about the interpretation of the sound. Someone might say a word, what you hear isn't what is being said, because we've got the manual part of our ear, like the vibration, like the eardrum and all of that malarkey. But the real genius comes in terms of how the brain converts that into something we actually understand. The same thing can happen with your eyes as well, with visual processing disorder, where your eye vision is completely fine, but it's the interpretation which has the difficulties. This is quite a good diagram to really bring to life the key differences between one and the other. While they aren't that similar, they are quite interesting because they are opposites of each other. Cognitive style just means how your brain processes information, okay? So autism is what we call a bottom-up processing condition. It means the way when your brain looks at the world around you, it pinpoints onto the micro detail first. Once it gets the real detail, that's when it starts to expand out to get the bigger picture. Where dyslexia, on the other hand, is seeing the big picture first, then getting more narrow. When you hear people saying, I'm a big picture thinker, that is what they mean. It means that you see the whole image first. If you look out the window, you see the whole scenery, the sky, the mountains, big picture. If you look out the window, one little daisy or one little bird, you're fixated on that one detail, that would be detailed orientated first. So those with autism are very detailed orientated. That's because their brains register those details first. This has been proven. They're also very good at analytical skills. Again, seeing the detail. Where those with dyslexia do often struggle with detail. That makes a lot of sense because when we're reading, we will skip details and be much better at skim reading. That might sound not like an advantage, but the advantage is we're very good at combining ideas, being able to take a little bit of all sorts and combining them together. Autism and dyslexia are very different conditions. The question is, if they are so different, how can you have both of them together? Because wouldn't one counteract the other? That is a question which honestly still needs answers. Those with autism may struggle with that. Those with dyslexia are very good at out-of-the-box thinking. This is a really simplistic view of it. Let's go even deeper down this beautiful cognitive rabbit hole. I apologize this image isn't great quality. It was copyrighted, but I have cited it. I think it'll be fine. You can see the autistic brain and the dyslexic brain. They do have a lot of overlaps, but they are also very distinct. As you can see here, the autistic brain is bottom up, very detailed orientated. It has much more thicker outsides in terms of the in white matter, and it also has much more connections. But you might think, surely more connections in the brain is better? Not, because there's a thing called synaptic pruning, which is, imagine your brain having like lots of offshoots. What typically happens is our brains trim a nice little bit of a haircut. We only select the best of the best connections. Autism, keep all the connection, more the merrier. But it might mean that some of your connections aren't as strong as others. Your brain might use a connection which is actually a bit of a dud road. Dyslexia is much more pruned, much more succinct. But because there are less connections, it will often skip details and it will take a much more to the point route. Very different. Autism might seem like a random bunch of conditions to do a versus against, but actually it makes a lot of sense because they are almost like inversions of each other. What I want you to do is to sort the symptoms. You're a diagnostic professional, because this is essentially how we diagnose people. There's no magic machine which diagnoses autism or dyslexia yet. It's all done through psychiatry by observations. We look at people, well, okay, this is simple enough. Knowing the difference between dyslexia and autism is actually relatively easy compared to, say, autism and ADHD or dyslexia and dysgraphia. But when you are in the middle or when you have both characteristics, this is when it gets a little bit difficult. This image here shows cognitive diversity. This is essentially how our brain processes information. If you have most of the way you process is in a certain way, you get, say, an autism diagnosis. If you process in another way, you get a dyslexia diagnosis. But as we are people and often annoying, we don't fit neatly into boxes. Let's have a look at this. We've got verbal communication difficulties. This is autism. Typically, those with dyslexia wouldn't have verbal communication difficulties. In terms of verbal, I guess what we're talking about is being able to get ideas across. Actually, for that, I would say middle. Yep, let's go with the middle. We've got reading fluency challenges. Absolutely dyslexia. Those with autism typically don't struggle with this. They may struggle to relay the information, but in terms of their own interpretation, doesn't tend to be a problem. Specific interest focus, having that like real niche area, absolutely autism. Remember, we said autism is detailed orientated. It's bottom up processing. Yep, that's correct. Trouble organizing thoughts. Yep, that is both. For different reasons, I must say, but still the same outcome. Sensory sensitivities. Dyslexia also has some of those sensitivities. I would probably say it's a little bit there because autism is all sensory sensitivities, but with dyslexia, the ones that are more related to writing can be impacted. Writing issues, yep, dyslexia. Typically, those with autism don't have issues with writing. Remember, the likelihood that you fit nice and neatly into the autism box is very rare. You could be anywhere on the spectrum. Sarcasm, comprehension difficulties, yep, mostly very much autism. Maybe though, if the sarcasm is written down in a book, someone with dyslexia could find that difficult. Spelling and reading errors. Yeah, I'd say most of us got that right. Like I said, on the whole, it seems quite straightforward, but there are some where we don't fit quite neatly into the categories. That's where we could run into challenges. Let's have a look at some real life examples of individuals who have certain characteristics. I must do a disclaimer. We have severely simplified this. We have used a couple of cliche examples on purpose to illustrate the point. Struggles with social cues, intense interests in train, sensitive to noise and light, has expressive difficulties. Is that dyslexia, autism, or both? You're a diagnostic professional. Are you able to say without a shadow of a doubt, Autism, yes. There are a few theories for it. It's that because people with autism love details, dreams have an abundance of details. They are also very regimented, when they are meant to turn up. There's a lot of things which just make sense. But obviously, it doesn't have to be trained. It could be any area of particular interest. Social cues can be very challenging, where those with dyslexia typically pick up very well on social cues because if one area is struggling, another area will typically pick up the slack. Yep, really great. Oh, Marie loves dinosaurs rather than trains. Good on you. I love a good dinosaur. Anyway, moving on. Number 2 or 3. Age 8. Oh, this is Alex. Enjoys being read to, but struggles with independent reading. Mixes up letters, excels in verbal discussion. Is this dyslexia, autism, or both? Nice. At the moment, these are all fairly straightforward. Enjoys being read to. Often mixes up letters. We're not saying they're like jumping around, but when you read things, it's quite easy to get a G or a D mixed up. Your pronunciation can be completely off. Typically excels in verbal discussion. While this is a bit of an extreme situation, I often think of Daredevil, the superhero, where because he wasn't able to see, he became a crime-fighting badass. Obviously, that's extreme, but the same principle applies. If you struggle in one area, you'll typically put your eggs in another basket and you'll become better in that area than your peers. Taylor, age 12, talented in art, struggles with reading and writing, prefers small social groups, needs routines. Dyslexia, autism, or both? Both. To be honest, this quiz was pretty easy, right? I did one for each. But that aside, talented in art, that doesn't really tell us either or. There is a bit of a link between those with dyslexia who are good at art, because again, if you struggle in one area, you'll tend to put more effort in another area. Struggles with reading and writing, that's very much dyslexia. Prefers small social groups, that is more likely to be autism, but of course doesn't have to be. Needs routines. Then we've got a double whammy there. This is a really simple way of doing it, but this is how people are often diagnosed. If they have things which go in 2 boxes, there isn't a category for, say, dyslexia and autism as one, so they give you 2 different diagnoses. As some of you say you've got ADHD and autism, a new term is joining them together as odd ADHD. Yeah, I think it's because it's so common to be joined together. The phrase for dyslexia and autism, I don't think it exists. All right, let's see how we all did. Typical. All right. Yep. Solid Joe and Frosty. Well done, everyone. All right, on to the home stretch now. Clinical and educational responses. How do the establishment deal with dyslexia and autism together or differently? In education, we often look at a spiky profile where we look at what people's strengths or weaknesses are. While there are profiles that are reminiscent of autism, it's not as simple as that. You might be really good at reading, really bad at communication. Your ups and downs can vary dramatically. This is why looking at individuals individually is much better than looking at just generic labels. On here, I want you to rank the interventions that would be most critical for supporting individuals with a comorbidity of dyslexia and autism. How do we support people who have both? Are there any adjustments which would benefit both at the exact same time? What do we have here? At number 1, most of you have said continuous education and training could benefit both if you have that co-occurring condition. Workplace accommodations. Yep. We've got mentorship and peer support groups. I think they can be a really valuable thing. Cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm with you on putting that at the end, unless it's specialized towards those with autism. Because I do find a lot of the time it's that kind of generic CBT and it needs to be a little bit more personalized. However, if you notice, most of these are all more soft approaches rather than technological based. Other accommodations that could benefit both at the same time is community integration programs, helping people make connections face to face, mindfulness and stress management techniques, speech language therapy, occupational therapies, assistive technologies, professional development. So all of these are a good basis. If you're like, I don't know what condition I have, or I don't know which one I should focus on, there are some which you can do all at once. Think of neurodiversity like a lovely cocktail. We all have different ingredients or characteristics. It's about just finding out the right balance for you. Here are some Nice bits of further reading if any of you want to dive in deeper and find out where we got today's information. Check it out. We recorded this so you can watch it later if you like. Take a picture if you'd rather. If any of you do have dyslexia and autism, or one and the other, you can get support in the workplace. Go to a workplace needs assessment, go on our website. Essentially, if you scroll down, you fill in this little form, it means you can get free support in the workplace. The best thing about this is you do not have to have an official diagnosis, because the likelihood of having a diagnosis for both is slim. That's because the way we diagnose people is that you typically go to a professional who is qualified in one thing and not the other thing. So then you'd have to go to 2 assessments, and we know how long the waiting list is. What a palaver. The great thing is, once you are an adult, support is available regardless of any official documentation. As a child, though, it's a little bit different. I often find, as long as you have one diagnosis, you're typically covered for most things. You don't have to collect them all. In school, I was officially autistic on their paperwork, but it was my dyslexia that affected me more, but I was still able to get support for my dyslexia because I had the autism one. I know, real confusing process, but you kind of got to work it. Any last questions before we wrap up today on autism and dyslexia? Oh, Marie says, I had to pay for a private dyslexia diagnosis for my 30-year-old. Honestly, Marie, it sucks at the moment. The NHS is really stretched and the waiting lists are horrific, even if you're lucky enough to get onto them. The NHS really aren't that keen on diagnosing specific learning difficulties. They are much more likely to diagnose broader neurodevelopmental disorders. Maybe because they have more wide-ranging impacts on life. But as we know, just because something doesn't impact every element of your life doesn't mean that the elements it does impact aren't very significant. What countries do you do workplace assessments for? The free ones via the government are for UK only. Definitely England, definitely Wales. Scotland is slightly different, and Northern Ireland is a bit different as well. But we do private ones worldwide. Oh, God. Okay. Thanks, everyone. If you do have any questions later on the line, feel free to message me. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is where you can watch all the previous webinars and recordings. This is a picture of me that AI created. It was really scary. I probably won't be doing that again. And we also have Facebook groups for those with autism. We also have ones for dyslexia. But maybe if enough people resonate with having both conditions, it's always a possibility. We also have online neurodiversity tests, which I think are really interesting. If you want to understand the characteristics and the symptoms and the qualities that typically professionals look for when diagnosing these conditions, these tests are really useful. They aren't official. You're not going to get anything proper out of it, but they're quite useful in terms of understanding the breakdown on what each condition has. You might be able to look at which ones overlap, compare. Here's our contact details if you do want to ever get in contact. It's nice to hear from people. Pick up the phone, maybe. We won't, but you can still contact us. Drop us an email. We do reply to those and go on our general website. All right, we are done, everyone. I hope you found that useful. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day. Go and enjoy yourselves. Hopefully see you at the next one. I will try and come up with a good name for autism and dyslexia that I can actually read, because that's my biggest fault with the word dyslexia. It's not the easiest to read. So I think we need a bit of a revamp where we can come up with a new name. Anyway, we'll come to that later. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much for attending. Bye.